Welcome to Conversations with the Smith Family. I'm Doug Taylor, the CEO of the Smith Family, and in this series, we're exploring the big issues affecting young people, their education and their future, and how we can break down barriers to help all young people thrive at school and beyond. And I'm speaking today with Jesse King. Jesse's a descendant of the one-year people, and he's got a real passion for education and the opportunities it can create in life. He's been a classroom teacher, a coach, and school leader, and he's worked extensively in curriculum development, particularly as it relates to Indigenous knowledge into STEM, and thinking about how to make learning and education authentic in the classrooms. Jesse's held a number of roles at organisations like the Stronger Smarter Institute, and is now the head of data and impact at the Aurora Education Foundation. And for us at the Smith Family, we're very grateful because he sits on our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander advisory group. We really benefit from his knowledge and wisdom. And he also is chair of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Mathematics Alliance. At the Smith Family, we support 17,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people. We know very well of the challenges that they face and their peers and communities face in the gap in learning outcomes compared to the wider Australian population. And that's why this is a really important conversation for us at the Smith Family. And I think you'll find it incredibly interesting as Jesse thinks about how to make education more inclusive and equitable so that all young people, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people, have the opportunity to make the most of their education and thrive. So Jesse, it's really great to have you with us today. We're an education's children's charity, as you well know, and we love hearing about people's education journey. So what's your most memorable education moment?
My mother was a teacher, so I grew up in staff rooms and schools, and I went to school, then worked in schools, so I felt like I was in schools the whole time. So there's many memories, but I guess for my most memorable moments in education are having teachers who just really believed in me. I can remember the hard times. I can remember the times I was probably slacking off a bit. And, those teachers who believed I could be whatever I wanted to do, and when they'd pull me up and say, hey, come on, we need to get into this. And I knew they cared about me, and they wanted me to have a crack. And I think back and definitely wanted to be that in my teaching approach as someone who believed in the students.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. I was just thinking about this the other day, and I was thinking about Miss Conti, my general studies, or now it'd be kind of social studies teacher, and kind of fired up my learning and interest and showed some personal interest in my own education. There's always a teacher, isn't it? There's always somebody.
Yeah. No, I'll shout out to Mrs. Taylor in grade 5. She moved me up to close to her desk because I used to talk too much, and then but yeah, she definitely got me on track, and was a fantastic teacher to have.
Jesse, moving on in our conversation, and you know very well the Closing the Gap data report, and you know that only 4 of the national socioeconomic targets are currently on track to be met, and targets for Year 12 or equivalent qualifications or tertiary education, youth engagement are improving, but not on track to be met, and early childhood development, sadly, the outcomes there continue to get worse. You know the education sector incredibly well, about teaching, leadership, curriculum and research and policy from all those different dimensions. So with all of that in mind, what do you see as the biggest barrier for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people in schools today? And why these barriers, it's seemingly so persistent?
I think when we look at the Closing the Gap targets, we get it's a big job. There's a lot to do, and there's so many different facets. So we're talking about early childhood access or Year 12 completion. They're 2 targets, but they're probably related to every target that exists in there. And when we're looking at these big, massive system change things, it gets overwhelming for people. and it creates a deficit mindset. It creates a mindset of, oh, how am I going to move this? How am I going to move these things? And I think we need to simplify the approach back down to what I can control, and what we can control as Indigenous people working in spaces and non-Indigenous allies around the work, a lot of the work that's done across Australia. We don't want to get into a circular conversation about what isn't working. Well, that stops process and it beats us all down. We want to find what is working, how do we get around those initiatives that are working, and in which ways they're working, and how do we scale those out, because they're going to look different in each and every community. And I think that's important for, we can think about all these big systems changes, but what's most important are the kids that are right in front of you right now, and how are you responding to them, how are you making them feel heard and seen and safe and belonging, and that goes a long way to moving the dial on a lot of these targets.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, I love the way you've thought about that, Jesse. You're right. It is overwhelming and disempowering to kind of look at it at the highest level. And you're absolutely right to help us think about kind of where's the momentum for change? How do we get around that, and how can we contribute to that, given who we are and where we sit in that context? So, with that in mind, and thinking about genuine equity and inclusion in education, where do you see that kind of momentum for change in classrooms or communities or the kind of wider systems in which we operate, things that had that promise around really closing out the gap? What's your perspective on that?
We've got to recognize that thinking about sameness and trying to fit everyone into the same box isn't a great approach. We're sort of taught as people in our society, do unto others as you do want done to yourself, be respectful. There's some sort of basic things that we should treat everyone the same in, but then there becomes this part where the differences emerge, and that's what makes Australia such an amazing place. We have this amazing group of differences between us, and it gives us an edge in a lot of things, economically, in our space in global politics and stuff like that. And I don't think we really take advantage of that enough, because as Australians, we do try and keep things the same. There's crabs in the bucket or tall poppy syndrome. So a thing that can change is recognizing that we want to treat people equally, but we have to recognize the differences that we all bring as human beings, and as professionals in the education space. We have to then recognize how to adapt our practices and behaviors to make sure that we're reaching those young people and providing that safe space for them, and helping them progress in their journey. And it may not be jumping from an E to an A. It's about finding that bit of progression, and celebrating learning, and making sure that we are passing on this love of learning and this value for learning. It sounds all like a bit rosy, and the reality of it is sometimes kids don't want to learn a lot of the time as well. So you've got to find ways to make it exciting, and you've got to
That's right.
bring things in, and you make it fun, and the teachers do an amazing job all across the board, and very, very challenging situations. And so I think a thing I'd like to see is us as Australians recognize how the hard work teachers put in. I was the child of a teacher, and my brother's a teacher now, and his partner, and there's a lot of work that goes into teaching, and I don't think a lot of people would want to do it. So we need to get around our teachers and value their professional perspectives, and value their approaches to things, and give them that time and space to be creative and be innovative.
Yeah, so good, beautifully said, Jesse. And I've got a couple of teachers in my household, and I, like you, see, I mean, their dedication, but also the work they do, student by student, in kind of understanding, okay, where might be the challenges, but to your point, kind of where are those areas of interest that are really going to fire up learning for individual students, and that's really what makes the difference, isn't it, in so many ways?
Yeah, definitely. And success comes in all shapes and sizes. And I think when we think about Year 12 completion or NAPLAN, we just narrow our focus of success into these really small things that are important to lots of people, and are important, but we don't want to lose sight of all those other bits of success. Everyone wants positive reinforcement. So, yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Yeah, great. Jesse, I'd like to talk a bit about your work, because it's really significant and important. I think holds great promise, and I think we're all very interested in it. Certainly we are at the Smith family. So Aurora's new initiative, RISE, which stands for Redefining Indigenous Success in Education. Interested in understand what the vision is behind that work, and tell us a bit about the kind of journey to where you are in
Yeah.
implementing it, and maybe what you've learned along the way.
Yeah, definitely. It's a really Aurora Education Foundation's been around for a bit over 15 years, and sort of started off doing different internships and scholarships and sending Indigenous people who were able to gain entry into like Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard, and getting scholarship funding around them to send them to some of these, esteemed global institutions so they could come back and apply those skills. Since then, there's been over 100 scholars have graduated overseas, and over 50% of these scholars didn't enter into their undergraduate course in the normal pathway, like finish year 12, get an ATAR, go into university entry in the sort of traditional pathway. They went in through alternative entry programs. So Aurora recognized that and thought, well, that means that we need to do something around the high school experience. And the high school program was built at Aurora, and then designed to get more students in through the traditional pathway. So there's not, other barriers that they face when they get into undergraduate study. So they ran a pilot project of that and got it independently evaluated. And the pilot project found that the high school program doubled year 12 attainment when compared to the national average. It tripled ATAR attainment, and it doubled university transitions. So something was really working in this program. And so around that time, the Paul Ramsey Foundation was sort of saying, "What's your biggest and brightest idea? What do you think? What could you do if you could do anything?" And Aurora thought, "Well, we've got this amazing program. We know it works, but we want to know which parts of it work, when do they work, and when are they the most impactful." So Rise was sort of designed in the sense of, okay, we're going to evaluate our programs, but we're also going to evaluate how success is measured in education. So we did a series of work. We looked at the literature, and we looked at all these quantitative survey results from like PISA and NAPLAN and things like that. But what was most exciting, I think, is we did these conversations with students, their families, and alumni who had gone and from Aurora had gone and succeeded at these global institutions. And what we're able to do was we're able to create an outcomes framework that looked at what Indigenous success in education meant to Indigenous people and what was important to them in that context, in their community context. I'll just be very clear that it's not for the entire country. You'd have to do the sort of similar approaches in local communities. We did it with cohorts in Western Sydney. And guess what? Year 12 attainment was important. School attendance was important. Getting good grades was important. But so was a whole bunch. They were just like one little sliver of this big, beautiful outcomes framework we have, that looks at academic and career outcomes. It looks at cultural identity or Indigenous identity, and it looks at social and emotional well-being. And then it relates it to the student, to their family and community, and to the education system. So what we then did was we designed a series of tools that we provide services to the students through the high school program. We survey them and their families. We have focus groups, and we do all sorts of stuff. And what we can see is what parts of our program have the most impact on the different elements. And what we're really excited to do is we've been working close with the New South Wales Department of Education to look at ways we can link data sets. And we can look at not only what's important to Indigenous people, but the data sets that are important to the education system, and find out what is complementary to that and what may be contrasting as well, and how we can say, look, if you really want to improve attendance measures in this community, these are the things you should be focusing on, rather than just some sort of broad approach. I think the tool really gives us a really exciting opportunity to articulate success from that community's perspective, and then design support initiatives to promote that success.
Well, it's terrific, Jesse, and we've had the benefit of you sharing with us that work in recent times, and it's terrific. And given that the Smith family, we're supporting 17,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people, that really kind of holistic way that you're working holds great promise, and we're all keen to see it grow and the kind of insights to come from that as well. Jesse, one of the things that you've thought a lot about is Indigenous knowledges into STEM. Now, STEM's increasingly critical in education, of course. Tell us a bit about why you think it's so important and potentially beneficial for students and teachers, particularly that Indigenous knowledge dimension.
Yeah. So one of my other voluntary commitments is I'm the chair of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Mathematics Alliance, which works with Professor Chris Matthews, and his model around the Gumpi model around looking at the maths in reality and then abstracting it to the mathematics and then reflecting it back. It's a really simple but interesting and important framework, and then it looks at things like critical thinking, creativity, and it looks at how you make maths real. Because for a lot of us, maths is just textbook questions on the board, stuff like that. It's hard to conceptualize it into, everything around me is mathematical. And I guess sort of as I've worked with Chris and I work with other great thinkers in this Indigenous knowledges in STEM space like Joe Sambono, you get to see that thinking about STEM isn't like a Western concept of knowledge or whatever. And if you look at where like science and things came from, there a lot of stuff came out of the Middle East and, to grow our global understanding. But Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on this continent had lots of different understandings of STEM and applied them in lots of different creative ways. And, and when you're teaching all Australian students, but particularly young Indigenous students, using these, these mob around here, they were able to decide which method of fire stick were the best way to start a fire and the most efficient, which is a really good understanding of transfer and transformation of energy. And it means we can all get around and be proud of all this really crazy stuff that's been going on for millennia on this continent. STEM's existed for forever, right? And all different cultures have different interpretations and applications of it. We're in a space in Australia now where we can really look at traditional and contemporary activities of traditional knowledges, and it's going to help us to solve some of these global emerging issues that we're going to face over the next few generations, and we've got to think divergently, and we've got to think about all the different ways to solve some of these global challenges where us as the human race are going to have to deal with.
Yeah, and it really builds on what you were saying before about not having the kind of the deficit mindset, when we were talking about the closing the gap and the challenges, but thinking about, how we can have a strength-based approach by drawing on traditional knowledge in education. What a great way forward. Jesse, we've talked about the importance of education from your early years, but has anything maybe more recently or over your careers really kind of set equity much more as a drive for you?
When you stop and you think back and you look at like things, and not just in your life, but in your parents' life and in your grandparents' life, that common thread of defining your own success and having your own self-determination and being able to make choices were all based around education. That was the access point, irrespective of the socioeconomic situation or the location of where they lived. My grandparents, it's instilled into my parents a strong sense of education and got them to certain points that they were able then to have choice on the next steps in their life. And that's an amazing gift to give to people. And people say, like, what do you boil education down to? And it's just about like making sure that everyone has the tools to make their own decisions. And I think that's all people want. You don't want to tell people what to do. Most people don't like being told what to do, but if we can create a place where everyone has freedom of choice, and that's what self-determination to me is, and that's why I really value education and making sure that everyone has that equal opportunity to apply their choice in their place and space.
Yeah, what a wonderful way to kind of draw our conversation to a close, Jesse. Look, thank you for that. I really encourage listeners to look up that work that Aurora is doing around the RISE program. It's a terrific initiative, and learn more about the STEM agenda with traditional knowledge. It's a great point that you've given us today. So look, Jesse, thank you for your time, and thanks everyone for listening in. If you want to know more about our conversations at the Smith family, jump on to thesmithfamily.com.au. Thank you.